The headquarters in Rio, but they also have campus in São Paulo and Brasília. We have three. I work Rio and São Paulo. I live in Rio, but also work in São Paulo campus.
I was in Brazil once, a long time ago, in São Paulo and Florianópolis. And it was a summer I never forget. When I came back, I was homesick.
What?
I don't know, it was just like something about Brazil that just stole my heart.
Ah, cool. You didn't return?
After that? Up to now, I never really had the opportunity. It was just at that time, this good friend of mine, his girlfriend's mother,
No, I think for Brazil is more or less like here. You are kind of mix. Immigration, installation, people come very easily, you get integrated. Because you are.
There's also so much diversity.
Yeah, like a little bit like you come, you don't even ask where you're from.
One thing that was also support from the church, so these friends brought me.
Oh, that's great. I was
Yeah.
thinking about you. Yeah, my brother studied there.
For my relative, yeah, German.
Great. That's
Speak
excellent.
old German.
Basically,
I have a cousin. She's married to a German guy, and she studied German literature. And both live in Florida. They teach in the university. German in the University of Florida. Yeah, and they do study this. My cousin, she studies German. Yeah, no, I want to have like before. And they study these German of the old times. Because it was the German of 19th century. Like my family, my mother from Italy came 2 years ago, but they speak a language that they don't have Italy anymore. Because people stay isolated.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Patel College of Global Sustainability Speaker Series. This is our last seminar of this academic year. So this is a special seminar as well because we squeezed in this one because I was trying to get Jose to be here at the college for almost a semester, but this is the only time that will work out. So let me introduce Dr. Jose Puppim de Oliveria. Formally, he's a professor at the School of Business Administration of FGV. I can't pronounce the Portuguese. Fundacao?
Foundation.
Foundation.
FG.
Brazil. He also teaches at Fudan University in Shanghai and at the University of Andina Simon Bolivar, Quito, Ecuador. Last time we met was in China, right? At Fudan University, where I was giving a talk, and then he also teaches there. So we went there. We met before also at the University in Tokyo, where we worked together. He is a urban researcher. He has several publications. I'm not going through all the details. We have seen the details here. He's editor-in-chief of the journal Public Administration Development, and he's on the board of several other journals. He holds a PhD in planning from the MIT and Masters in Regional and Environmental Planning from Hokkaido University in Japan, and a Bachelor of Science and Engineering from Technology Institute of Brazil, ITA. And the talk is Cities, Climate Change and Sustainability. So about 45 minutes of talk, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. So let's put our hands together. Welcome, Dr.
I need to put the microphone out. This thing? No. I need.
Does he need or not?
No, I think not. Can you hear me in the back? You okay?
We're recording that.
Yeah, I think
For
because of
online
recording
students.
and how I done this on this. Yeah, maybe it went off. But no problem. I think if they can hear me, I will talk.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, Michael, too.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you, Professor Parayu. Thank you all for coming. Today is a pleasure to be here in the University of Florida in the Patel Center for Global Solutions. Since you moved here, it's a discussion how it would come and know more about your work the faculty and students are doing. It's my pleasure to be here also to share my time and thank you for time to meet and discuss things that you think important for sustainability. Now it's working? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Not sure if it's going to here. Hello? Yeah. Hello. Yeah. And it's my pleasure. What I try to do, I know that many of you here in faculty and also some of you as students, but I think most of you are kind of interested or aware of debate on sustainability. And we'll try to link more specifically the discussions that is more my general interest in global issues, how this play out locally, and how these things are connected. And I have done a lot of work in the last 20 years in cities, particularly climate change related. But my particular interest in more political economy, how this play out in politics and public administration, in local governance, and how cities react to these pressures from outside. And what I try to do here, try to link to the broader debate on development, and how these climate change are very linked today to this broad sustainable development agenda that you have in many parts. I'm even surprised here, a lot of people know about the sustainable development going to cities, and I'm particularly interested in know how your experience as well. I planned like a presentation around 30-40 minutes, but it will be open to questions. If you want to interrupt me in the middle, have a question or comment or something you're doing, I would very much like to know more about your work as well. If you don't have any examples, I'll be very interested in to know more. That's basically as Professor Parry said, I work for this FGV. This is interesting because you're not a university, we're a think tank. 2/3 of our staff just do research. But you have a lot of schools more in the social science and law, and you have a lot of work in collection of indicators, executive education that actually keeps the foundation afloat. You don't live on the tuitions only because you leave a lot of work you do outside. We're the largest consulting group in Brazil now and do a lot of work with governments and companies, very connected to the real world. This is the idea of the foundation. You are ranked in the top 10 think tanks, and in the last 2 years, the best managed think tank in the world. And you do a lot of work in different areas of development. And you all work also, you see in a lot of policy, particularly in Brazil. We're very influential in Brazilian policy. But you have a large number of students, particularly executive education is our strength, but I teach more in the degree programs, in the undergrad and master and PhD in management. Would I pressure something wrong? Just start now the presentation by broad interest because, large urbanization, I'm going to show you the last a few decades. We also have evidence of climate change is affecting us. Even though some people don't believe, I think most of people believe, they just don't believe how it's actually affecting us. Also, what's interesting, this is more and more connected, cities and countries, and they have this global agenda, Paris meeting, Kyoto, and now have this the 2030 development agenda. Also have a lot of data and information they didn't have before. Now we know a lot of things from other countries that you didn't have the information before. It was difficult to get this data. Now it's very easy to go to the internet to find out what's happening in St. Petersburg or in Kuala Lumpur, basically through the internet. But I'll say the ones who work in management, the theory is practiced still pretty much on boundaries of the organizations, or in the case of the city is just interested this is my municipality, I just care about what's here, I don't care what's happening outside. But with this global agenda, more and more you're being affected by what things happen outside the cities, but still our systems not in place to deal with those issues. And my interest came more on this side, how these things play out. And at the same time, have more, how we can get more evidence, use evidence research, science to make policies. And at the same time, how scientists also understand better the policy world, what kind of science, what kind of communication you need to have in order to have impact in the real world for the science you are doing. And the city is particularly being on the spot. Now we are planning, I was in this conference last year, it will be in the next, there is the IPCC, International Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, that is the more scientists that work in climate change. And we are planning a report on cities. The next cycle, in 2022, you have start a report only on cities, because we're going to explain you what's the important cities for climate change. But this now is being in the agenda. And how this linked to this, what called 2030 Development Agenda. This, some of you may be familiar. You had these kind of Millennium Development Goals. That was the main agenda since 2000. The UN proposed this agenda, these goals that most of the countries had to reach. But in 2015, you changed this agenda with this new report that transformed our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, that came out in 2015. And in this they propose, instead of 8 goals, that's pretty much for, you discussing the lunch, for developing countries, countries like poverty, things that most rich countries like here, they have achieved. Most of them, it was not that important. But what happened is agenda nowadays, they have a more complex and broad set of goals that become relevant for all countries. Not only, and you will see the example, no country actually is developed now. Because if you use these indicators, all underdeveloped in one aspect or another. Not one country that reach all the goals at the same time, because you see, And in this agenda, we have to start thinking, if you, this agenda 2030 is actually because 2015 to 2030, 15 years, you have to achieve a lot of things based on those goals. But this transformation, I think, is only happening if you somehow keep the ecological boundaries. But you still need a lot of innovations there. When we talk about innovations, it's not rocket science, not NASA is talking to someone about NASA. NASA is important, but you don't need rockets. It's like very basic innovations going to give you the example. These basic innovations can have a much larger impact when you put like more innovation in terms of how we use the information and use the things that already exist at local level. But still, we are very far from a kind of comprehensive governance system, both at higher levels, national, international, but at local levels to get these things done. And then the big challenge is how, be my research, how to understand what cities are doing, how they're doing, why, and try to bring these lessons to much broader set of cities that where they are used. And I just give you this little report I helped to write, to coordinate. That's UNSCAP, this is the Asian Pacific branch of the UN, the Social Economic Commission. That about, you do every 5 years a development report, and this one was kind of transformations that you need to, was released in 2016. You can download from here for free, and then the idea that in Asia Pacific, what needs to be done to achieve this SDG, the Sustainable Development. Let me show you some of the data that's interesting for our discussion here, see how this is playing out empirically. The good thing is, if you look at, this is the carbon intensity of the economy. If you look at climate change, carbon intensity economy means how much carbon you emit per GDP, per dollar you produce. And what I see is a downward trend that's good. It means you become more efficient. You produce more GDP with less carbon over the decades. Not only Asia Pacific, but all continents. You have a downward curve. But the interesting thing, that's a big difference here. You see this is Latin America, the bottom, and the top is Asia Pacific. It means Asia Pacific pretty much produce twice as much carbon for the same amount of GDP as Latin America. Why this is important? Because where the growth is happening. the economic growth in Asia Pacific was the engine of the world economy, and it's a large economy, but they produce twice as much carbon per GDP as Latin America. That's why a lot of increase in the emissions you're going to see. Sometimes you see relations is economic growth and poverty. You see like grow more, even you don't distribute very well. We have huge trend of reduction in poverty. Like only China was 700 million people in 30 years out of poverty because of economic growth. But at the same time, you see the other part, the huge increase in the emissions. Both this is by country. Now China is the largest emitter, even, and Europe now is kind of only 10% of the emissions. You want more discussion why the Kyoto Protocol didn't work anymore, because the countries that were buying the credits, Europe mostly, they are only 10% of the emissions now. It's a huge increase, this by country, absolutely no. But even per capita, now China emits more or less around the same as Europe, with a per capita income much lower, 3 times less than Europe. But the emissions in China is much larger per capita, even per capita than Europe. Part of this is the kind of economy they have. I showed the graph to you. The economy of Asia is pretty much based, I would say, in coal, the energy part, and it has a huge impact in terms of emissions per capita. Now the kind of model development you see coming, and India is also picking up, is pretty much based on these fossil fuels. And see the difference is how this play out when you talk about these countries. And and the big point about the Sustainable Development Goals is exactly, if you look at here is the Human Development Index is a measurement of development. 1 is very developed, 0 is very underdeveloped. And here is the footprint, could be the carbon emissions, for example. Well, see, all countries that are here is more Europe, North America, some Asian countries, and here's pretty much Africa and some Asia and Latin America. It means as countries underdevelopment, the footprint is very low. When the countries start developing, is increase their footprint. And all the countries historically, you look at all the countries, they develop in terms of human development index, human development, increasing the footprint. And if you put this green part is exactly what be the sustainable development, how you develop without increase the pressure on the planet, that you're going to see the consequences. And when you see no countries actually inside this box, it means, what I said, no countries actually developed now, because they couldn't achieve the human development, high development in terms of human development with low emissions, low footprints. It means a lot of things they develop, we're going to see they actually push a lot of the harm to other parts of the world. And then this is how it plays. And the challenge of the SDG is exactly how put all the countries here. The countries are here, how they make higher human development index without increase their footprint. I mean, they have to do a different curve from what we hear. And the countries that already developed the high human development index, how to bring them down to have low emissions. And I think this will be the big challenge for the SDG. Why cities? Why cities play important? There's most of the population today live in cities. Countries like here is 80%, Brazil is even more urban, it's 90%. Here is 85%. They also, but they just a small part of the area, just 3-4%. And a lot of activities, GDP in general 80%, 90% of GDP in some countries in cities, produced by cities, and a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions as well. And but at the same time, there's challenges, but also the opportunities to cities where you have knowledge, you have finance, you have social capital, people to get things done. And the challenge now is exactly how to harness this power of cities to turn around the harm from creating the problems to actually having the solutions. And you see pretty much, I would say, correlated. You see urbanization here, and if you match with that curve, it's pretty much you see countries that urbanize, they start emitting more. Countries in general, when they urbanize, they become richer, we say, okay, because they're richer now, they're more urbanized, they emit more. But at the same time, the work you did, you showed there's a more correlation. This is basically correlation between CO2 emissions and urbanization rates, one side, and GDP CO2 emissions in the other side, per capita. What you see is the urbanization is more correlated to CO2 emissions than GDP and GDP per capita. It means that two countries with the same wealth per capita, the country that's more urbanized is going to most likely emit more CO2 than the country less urbanized. Now, urbanization plays a big correlation with GDP, but at the same time it's more correlated to CO2 than GDP. They go hand in hand. At the same time, it's interesting because we look at just to now most of the population in the world since 2010, beginning of this decade, is urban, more than 50%. Also, urbanization is pretty much linked to the economy, but also lifestyle, a lot of things that related to greenhouse gas emissions. And just give you an idea, in Asia, 1 billion people moved to the city in the last 20 years, and another billion will be moving to cities in the next 20 years. This just to have an idea. I know there's some Chinese here, but do you know how many cities in Western Europe with more than 1 million inhabitants, or in the US? We have an idea how many cities more than 1 million in the US? Or Europe, Western Europe? Less than 20. Just China is 200, and India now is almost 100. China and India together like 300 cities with more than 1 million. In Europe and West together is less than 40 or 50. It means the urbanization scale we have in Asia is unprecedented. You know, there is no other period in human history can compare with urbanization in Europe, but it's kind of cities of 2 million, but now have massive cities, not only massive cities that has 1 million, that I even showed to Ping, you know, some list of cities more than 1 million, he didn't know the names, because it was like maybe like 10 years ago they had only 5,000 inhabitants, now have like 2 million. The urbanization rate is so massive. And the other two big chunk of the world population, India and Africa, is still very underdeveloped in terms of urbanization. They're going to urbanize very fast in the next 20 years. And if they follow the same trend as China, and then we have unprecedented emissions that come in from this urbanization process. No? It means the impact of cities, you could look at, most of people look just local, you know, just look at things, it's administrative borders. But the cities, they drive a lot of resources from outside. They do produce, we're going to show the end the research you're doing in food, water, energy. Most of food, water, energy cities come from outside, from other cities or from rural areas, and at the same time, you have global. You know, they push not only emissions of climate change that affect other places, but a lot of drivers of deforestation in the Amazon or Borneo, someone talked about biofuels, is because someone is buying these biofuels or is buying this timber and it's coming from there. Not the local people. A lot is not used by local people. They actually sell these through drivers come from elsewhere. It means that when you call about climate change cities, here's what you came about our main part of the talk is you're talking about mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is to reduce the emissions of the greenhouse gases. And adaptation is, you know that even if zero emissions tomorrow, you're going to have a lot of impacts coming now in the future. And then adaptation is basically how to adapt our companies, our cities, particularly to these effects of climate change. So they have these two parts. And then we have a lot of research done in the beginning in this part called sectoral issues, like energy, transportation, and then move to kind of physical issues like building, and cities start having more complexity. You know, buildings, land use, and things that you don't understand that much. And more in the beginning for just make cities more compact. Like here in the US, you know, many urban studies were new urbanism, just make mixed use, compact, and so, but a lot of emissions come actually from energy, you know, how you, or the buildings, how to heat the buildings or air conditioning. Say that China, again, the big increase in emissions, you can imagine what industry, industrialization, a lot of, China had less than 1 million air conditioners in 60s. Now they have 600 million, all plugged in full time, cooling and heating, massive energy that you need to make this happen. And then you come down, other issues that you call more regional issues. City, what it's doing is that a lot of the resources driven from around the city, from other places, but also impacting other places. If you put a new industry here, in Tampa, probably St. Petersburg, some of the suppliers will be there, and some people will be living in St. Petersburg and working here in the city. Affects a lot the economy and the resources around it. And these are something you still don't know much about. And finally, what called green agenda, the consumption, the issue about cities. You're going to see the example of how to measure climate change emissions. We're going to talk about the inventories. If you look at the production, maybe you're doing well, London, but you see the consumption, and things can turn around, because the big issue about cities, they consume a lot, things that come elsewhere, and the harm is not polluting the city here, but maybe causing harm problems elsewhere. It's why you see when you talk about the urban emissions, how you measure greenhouse gases.
Excuse me, can you go back one?
Yeah.
Just as I click the button, you change.
Yeah, but it will be available, the presentation
Okay.
later on. But it's basically, it's get more complex to understand. You understand more about the top, and you understand less about the bottom. And in terms of also understand the problem, I also understand the solutions. I said consumption is talking someone in lunch, and it's called steady state. There is this theory about steady state, don't grow the economy, don't grow the consumption. It's good theory, but I don't know any mayor that was elected saying with zero growth, negative growth in Tampa for the next 10 years. I think we don't get elected, not even for council.
Degrowth.
Degrowth. Degrowth, exactly. Maybe you get in North Korea somewhere, but not in a democracy, people. And there's the issues that we can talk later. But how do you said is if you measure, there are a lot of ways to measure the account for the emissions in cities. Most of them is based on this IPCC methodology that's called production-based approach. That is what emissions coming out from the factories, the cars, and they take into account some of the electricity as well. But if you turn around, particularly in cities that they do some studies, they start like the methodology that's much more complex, because look at the life cycle of things. You call consumption-based emissions inventories. What it means, you, instead of measuring what's coming out, you do the other around, what you consume and how much emissions this causes elsewhere. Because what happened, a lot of get London got very green, actually moving a lot of factors to Asia and just importing the goods. And here as well, our factories went to Asia, and they now just consume what's coming from there. And they say, okay, you're not polluting anymore, but basically we're consuming the things that are polluting elsewhere, how we count these things. And now people are doing a lot of these kind of combination, how we're actually taking into account production, but also consumption. In China, it would be the opposite. Some cities in China, they do only what they consume. They produce a lot to export, but what they consume is very little. You have different numbers. It could be like 3 times. They have done this for same city. The 2 methodologies can have the difference in Manchester and London could reach like 3 times more emissions if you do the consumption-based part instead of doing on the emission.
What is that combination?
Yeah, the combination is for example, they account for certain things that are easy to measure. For example, electricity. You don't have any thermal power plant here, but the electricity is coming from St. Petersburg for the power plant. But you're using electricity, and you account for these things. Certain things but as you start putting more things, then it becomes more complex. Like